I think the following game is interesting from the point of view of assessing under what circumstances black should play bishop g4. Bishop g4 clearly is a move which has a certain amount of potential in that it would ordinarily hit a white knight on f3, which also attacks key squares in the center, namely d4 and e5. But black needs to be somewhat careful when playing bishop g4 that the bishop doesn't get sidelined or doesn't simply get traded. And this game and some of the related games, I think, illustrate this principle quite well. I should mention that bishop g4 is a move which, in the Spanish, has increased viability, or rather arises more often in a lot of these lines where white plays an early d3. So the lines where white plays with c3 followed ultimately by d4, it's quite clear in those lines that white ordinarily would want his pawn on h3. But in these slower systems with c3, d3, knight bd2, he often delays putting his pawn on h3 for a longer period of time, which means that players of the black pieces need to be familiar with the circumstances when they should play bishop g4. So Leko uses this very popular early d3, d6, c3 castles, rook e1, rook e8. So all of this is very standard. And here d4, b5, bishop c2 was played, and now Gustafsson played bishop g4, which is a move which Marin criticizes, and I think he's right to do so, in particular in light of what happens in the game. So Leko starts with h3. This is the typical putting the question to the bishop, which Bobby Fischer advocated, and I mean it's pretty easy to see that bishop takes f3, knight takes f3 is just better for white. Black's given up the bishop for no particular purpose. The idea was to put the bishop on h5 when this pressure and the pin on the f3 knight causes the additional pressure on the white center. But the problem is that white's able to deal with this very comfortably. So he played with d5, knight e7. I should note that there was a previous game here with knight a7. Knight f1, c6, knight g3, bishop g6, bishop g5, takes here. This was Akopian against Atalik from Crete 2007, and is similar to the main game in that it's just a very comfortable position for white. The bishop on g6 struggles to find a role and can be further undermined with h4 and h5. White retains the standard option of playing on the queen side with a4. The black knight on a7 is sidelined, and white has good chances of central dominance based on his control of this d5 square. So knight a7 isn't really the solution either. Gustafsson played knight e7, knight f1, h6, and now a4. Apparently this is a novelty, but a very logical one. It's also possible for white, as previously played, to play with g4 when this bishop is truly buried. But again, playing g4 always involves a certain amount of a positional commitment, which Leko doesn't feel is necessary in this game, and I think he's probably right. So after a4, black played c6, exchange on c6, and now knight g3, and Gustafsson felt compelled to take on f3. Marin notes that bishop g6 isn't really an improvement, because after knight h4 followed by knight f5, black won't have anything better than taking on f5 anyway, which would probably lead to a transposition. But after bishop takes f3, queen takes f3, b4, knight f5, takes, we just have a position which is much, much better for white. He has an extremely strong knight in f5, and this light square bishop is going to be quite dominant. As often happens in the Ruy Lopez, it may appear slightly muted at the moment, but in the long run, this bishop can prove very effective down this diagonal, down which it will have no opponent because black has chosen to exchange his own light square bishop. So after a few more moves of maneuvering, white's just bringing his pieces to better squares. And now bishop c5. So black is struggling to defend all of his pawn weaknesses. And after this, white's achieved a real bind on the queen side, and we notice that there's an additional possibility for this bishop opened up on this diagonal, which could prove very unpleasant. The a6 pawn as well is chronically weak. It's not acceptable to have the queen playing nursemaid to that pawn for the rest of the game. So this position is just deeply unpleasant. And the rest of the game really did nothing to shake that assessment. Obviously, Peter Leko is one of the best technical players in the business, and this type of position has been hopeless to play against him since he's been about 11 or 12. So we see now that the light square bishop is really beginning to play very effectively, and just all of these light square weaknesses are quite fatal for black. And now white begins to target the a6 pawn, which can't really be effectively defended, clearly. Taking on b6 isn't the answer, because now this passed pawn on b6 is just enormously strong. So knight c5, I've got no doubt that a player of Gustafsson's caliber appreciated that this position is completely hopeless, but just a few more moves were made. Queen takes a6. So it turns out that black has managed to obtain the c3 pawn in compensation for his a6 pawn, but the problem is the relative difference between the quality of these two pawns was such as to compel Gustafsson to resign, because this pawn is just going to run to a7. So this is kind of I suppose, an advert against bishop g4, but it's important to note that one of the reasons why bishop g4 wasn't so effective was because white was able to advance in the center with d5, after which the black knight really struggled to find a square. And actually the bishop g4 resource here is quite viable, it just needs a little bit more preparation. So as Marin notes, there was a game played here after d4 where black took on d4 first, and then played b5, bishop c2, bishop g4. This could also have risen here in the game after b5, bishop c2. Black could take, and we reach the same position. But here after bishop g4, h3, bishop h5, we can see that if white were to continue as in the game with d5, black has a couple of interesting central responses, in particular knight d4, where he's at least going to trade some pieces. And Marin gives this variation, which I think is quite thematic. Bishop d3, c5 is interesting. takes and knight takes. And again, we've reached a position with quite a fluid centre in which the bishop on this diagonal begins to show its worth, because control of the d4 and e5 squares is quite important here. And also because the centre is fluid, it means that white, I think, is much more reluctant to make moves like g4. Because if he were to play a move like g4, then ultimately his king would be at hazard of being very exposed after black plays d5. So this is the type of position where I think the bishop on g4, the conditions have been created for the bishop on g4 to be quite effective. And in this particular game, white decided not to go for d5, but to play knight f1. And now, okay, black could take on f3, but after g takes f3, I think that white has reasons to be optimistic, because again his centre is very strong. It's true that his kingside pawns have been slightly compromised, but I don't think that that's going to be a significant difficulty after something like knight g3, followed perhaps by king h2 and rook g1, ultimately aiming for knight to f5 and play against the g7 pawn. So black correctly, in my view, chose not to take that, but instead to play with d5, e5, and now knight e4. And it's easy to see that if white were to take that, bishop takes f3 at the very least would be unpleasant to meet, because if white takes with the queen, then knight takes d4 is very strong, and if he takes with the pawn, then amongst other things black has this tactic, knight takes e5, because of the pin on the d4 pawn. So instead, after knight e4, white played knight g3. But after takes, pawn takes, now white's pawn structure is slightly compromised, and after knight b4, bishop b1, c5, black managed to continue his very active play, and after an exchange on c5, I think had the preferable position in view of his really quite impressive piece activity. So this was the game between Vallejo and Cabrera from Albos 2005, and Vallejo ended up losing that game with white to a lower rated player. But I think just an interesting microcosm of the bishop g4 idea, this position after d4. So it's an idea which clearly black doesn't need to consider if white's played h3, but if white omits h3, and bishop g4 is a serious resource for black, but it's one which has to be exercised with some care. And one of the better situations for the bishop to play is when there's some fluidity in the center, often created by this exchange on d4, as this game and some of the games given in the notes demonstrate.